My name is Richard Ulin, and this will be oral presentation number 4 for Geology 105 at KU. My topic is the evolution of Homo sapiens. The first primates evolved around 55 million years ago, and since then the evolution of Homo sapiens has come very far, from primates to full-blown civilizations and technological advances. The first of the human ancestors showed up between 5 and 7 million years ago, probably when some creatures like apes in Africa started to walk habitually on their own two legs. They were making very crude stone tools by about 2.5 million years before now. Then some of them went from Africa into Asia or Europe after 2 million years before now. Without bulletproof evidence, most scientists think that people who look like we do now, or the anatomically modern Homo sapien as people call them, evolved by at minimum 130,000 years ago from our Homo sapien ancestors who had stayed in Africa. Their brains had reached the size we see today. They also moved out of Africa and soon replaced the not-so-modern human species, like the Neanderthals in Europe and regions of Asia, and Homo erectus, seen in Java man and Peking man fossils in the Far East. But agreement shuts down entirely on the question of where, when, and how these modernly similar human beings begin to start creatively and symbolically thinking. They wondered when they began fully humanized, like when they thought like we do, looked like us, and were resourceful like us. They wanted to know when and where our culture was started. For much of the previous century, archaeologists hypothesized that today's behavior became so diverse relatively recent. In fact, about 40,000 years ago, and only after Homo sapiens had spread to Europe. They based their idea of a so-called creative explosion on findings like the amazing cave murals in Lascaux and Chauvet, but some rebel researchers thought that this theory was a throwback to the time when their thoughts were ruled by Eurocentrism. Archaeologists, the rebels said, were not just looking for an earlier inspiration in the correct places. Several discoveries lately in Africa and in the Middle East are giving the first physical proof to support an older, more slow evolution of modern behavioral traits, one not revolving around Europe, but other scientists, beyond accepting a few early spikes in Africa, remain unconvinced. Arguably, the creative dawn was the biggest major prehistoric event that archaeologists will ever find. Before the dawn, human anatomical and behavioral changes graduated hand in hand very slow. After that, the form of humans remained incredibly the same. While behavioral change went up drastically, in the area of under 40,000 years, more and more closely packed cultural revolutions have taken human life from the idea of a relatively rare big mammal to something more similar to a geological changer. In that state of mind, 40,000 years ago was the climax in human creativity, when today's Homo sapiens landed in Europe and left the earliest found meaningful artifacts of abstract and of symbolic thought. They were creating more technologically creative tools, burying their loved ones with ceremonies, and even showing a new type of self-awareness with necklaces, bead items, and pendants for body decoration, and in sharply small figures of the female body similar to dolls like what we have today. As time went by, they painted on cave walls something of their lives and thoughts in great sophisticated murals of deer, horses, and even wild bulls. A popular hypothesis in question is if modern human species interbred with other human species to get us where we are today. The most extreme version of this idea suggests that modern Homo sapiens, or humans, replaced the older generation of humans without any interbreeding at all. Now, the less extreme versions allow for a little bit of interbreeding between some of the groups, but also suggest that gene flow and mixing between the different species was extremely small. Results do make evident that modern humans and also Neanderthals did most likely interbreed, however, it was a very limited amount. Researchers put side to side the genomes of 5 modern Homo sapiens with the classic Neanderthal, showing that Europeans and Asians share around 1 to 4% of their DNA with Neanderthals or Africans. This tells us that today's humans bred with the Neanderthals after they left Africa, but not after they went to Asia and Europe. The most probable location is the Levant, where both species lived together for thousands of years at different times between 50 and 90,000 years before now. Shockingly, that data doesn't show broad-scale interbreeding between all the species that were in Europe, where it probably would have been given their close proximity to each other. The different physical traits that are seen in modern Homo sapiens from distant geographical spots around the Earth are hypothesized to have evolved over an extremely long period of time in Asia, Africa, and Europe as well, since the point when each region was completely settled. Now, while I showed plenty of archaeological evidence earlier, there's also a lot of genetic evidence for the existence of Homo sapiens. The extreme amount of similarities between human population shows in strong difference to what we see in our closest living relative today, the chimpanzees. In fact, there's a significant amount more genetic difference between two individual chimps taken from the same environment than there are between humans drawn from a random single event. And to go further with that, genetic variation between groups of chimps is ridiculously greater than the changes between European, Asian, and African humans. The low amount of genetic differences in today's human population suggests that today's human origin may reflect a fairly small original population for Homo sapiens. And analysis of mtDNA by Rogers and Harpending agrees with the idea that a small population of Homo sapiens, possibly only 10 to 50,000 people total, left Africa somewhere between 50 and 100,000 years before now. Scientists and researchers recently came out victorious in taking DNA from a few Neanderthal skeletons. Now, after meticulous data analysis of particularly the mtDNA, but also some of the nuclear DNA they found, it's obvious that Neanderthal DNA is quite different from our own. In analyzing the amount of distinction between their DNA and ours, the author shows that these two derivations have been apart for over 400,000 years. Language and speech are a couple of the most looked over topics in the history of Homo sapiens. But when we think about them, we realize how incredible it truly is for a population to speak and write to each other almost flawlessly. Only humans have developed a way to communicate with more than just signals and movements. A section of the brain that organizes our thoughts and puts them into sounds with meaning is unique to humans only. It isn't known when the formation of language really began. There's no set date. But what we do know is that it must have been a very long, lengthy process considering how many different tones had developed over the years. Homo sapiens have probably been speaking, as a matter of fact, for hundreds of thousands of years. However, not with the advanced dialects and tones we use today. As today's humans, the modern humans, we are genetically distinct from our Homo sapien ancestors that lived 10 to 20,000 years ago. In fact, it's extremely likely that the average rate of Homo sapien evolution has continuously increased in speed since the stop of the most recent ice age, which was about 10,000 years ago. This is mostly due to our human population explosively growing and moving into different kinds of environments, including the cities, where we've been held in front of a new natural selection process, unlike any other we've had. For example, our bigger and more populated places have made it much more easy for contagious diseases like smallpox, tuberculosis, plague, and flu to quickly spread throughout populations and destroy everything in their path. This has shown extreme selection for those who are lucky enough to have an immune system that allowed them to keep living. There's also been a notable change in diets and eating habits for many humans since the last ice age ended about 10,000 years ago. Now, it's less distinct and mostly vegetarian around the world with a heavy dependence on food made from grains that we've grown. It's likely that humanity has been able to change for these and for other environmental changes because it's acquired a much greater genetic diversity over time. A bigger population naturally has a greater amount of mutations, adding more variety to the gene code, simply because there's more people to have those mutations. This will happen even if the mutation rate per individual person remains the exact same. However, the rate of mutation may have actually gone up because we've exposed so many new kinds of artificial environmental pollution that causes more mutations to occur. Now, it's not clear to us what every one of those consequences of environmental or behavioral change for humanity has been, but it does seem to be that the average body size for us has been somewhat shortened in the last 10,000 years for height, and we've acquired a broad set of immunities to the more extreme effects of some diseases, like measles or the flu. There's even theories saying how it's possible in the future that humans will be immune from disease as a whole, but obviously it's impossible to say with certainty because there's millions of factors, many of which we don't even know about yet. It is possibly one of the biggest wonders that humanity has survived all of these years, from simple-minded animals to what is only described as brilliant and advanced today. We have come very far, and we can thank our Homo sapien ancestors for that. For millions of years, every human, early and today, had to find and hunt their own food. They spent a significant part of every day gathering and hunting for food and for supplies. By 164,000 years ago, the modern human was collecting and preparing shellfish for meals. By 90,000 years ago, we'd begun creating unique fishing equipment. Then, in just the past 12,000 or so years, our own species, Homo sapiens, made the switch to creating and harvesting food and recreating our surroundings. Our landscapes changed. Humans realized they could hold control of the growth and then breed certain plants and animals. This realization led to herding and farming animals for the first time. This land usage transformed natural earth, ground, and land around the world. As humans put more time into producing their own food supply, they created more advanced settlements. Villages would transition into towns. Towns would transition into cities. With more food ready to be dispersed, the human population started to rise exponentially, and still does today. Our human species was so successful at this point that it had created a turning point in the history of humanity on Earth without even the intention of it. Today's humans have gained a unique pair of physical and behavioral traits and characteristics, many that other primitive human species also had, though not to the same degree of complexity at all. The complex minds of modern humans enable them to interact with one another and their surroundings in new and exciting ways. As the world's environment became more unstable and undecided, broader minds helped our ancestors survive and thrive. They created specialized and unique tools and weapons, and used those to build other tools. They ate a bunch of different animal and plant foods. They eventually even had control over fire to cook and destroy. They lived in well-built shelters, exchanged vast amounts of resources across wide amounts of land. They even had their own pastimes for the first time. They had games, art, and more. Modern humans now exist on every continent in the world, and vastly had expanded their numbers recently. They've changed and manipulated the world with methods that benefit them incredibly. As with everything on our sometimes harsh planet, everything we have ever done has also opened up our humanity to new threats and experiences. Some say we're in the middle of an extinction, some say we're at the best point we've ever been at. But one thing stays true. Humans seem to always prevail and keep moving on. It's in our nature to adapt and to make things work, and we will continue to do so for millions of years if all goes well. The first Homo sapiens were 55 million years ago, but we live in an Earth where billions of years of life have gone by. So who's to say we can't do it for another 100 million years or more? Homo sapiens are evolving exponentially fast at this point. Maybe we don't even need this world soon. We could be somewhere completely entirely different.